The lid came off the first barrel just after 10, and the smell reached the yard gate before the mallet stopped ringing. 18 barrels, sent back from Newcastle, and everyone carried the same white chalk mark on the head. Gideon Rusk never asked where the fish had come from. He pointed at Agnes Bell, 35 years old and 5 years a widow, and said her salt had done it, and the carters laughed, because it was safer to laugh with the man who paid them. Agnes was owed 4 weeks of wages. She had no cottage, no credit, and nobody to speak for her. She had a blue cloth notebook in her apron, worn soft with salt. Rusk settled his debt with a 7-year lease on a dead smokehouse 4 miles from the railway, and what he did not know was that under the limewash of that building were 3 faded numbers that would decide who fed the coast. Tell me in the comments whether you would have signed. Agnes Bell had spent 21 years learning to tell a good herring from a bad one, and the trade had paid her for that skill in every season except the one that counted. She started at 14 in a yard at Bulmer under a forewoman named Ellen Heron, who was 61 then and had hands like knotted rope, and who taught her the knife in the first week and the eye over the next 4 years. Ellen made her handle bad fish on purpose, once a week, so she would know the difference in the dark. On the last Friday of the season in 1850, she gave Agnes a small book bound in blue cloth and said one thing about it. "Write what you saw before somebody tells you what you saw," she said. Agnes had filled 11 of those books since. The 12th was in her apron on Saturday, the 10th of August, when a cart came up the road to Gideon Rusk's yard at 10:30 in the morning. It was the wrong cart and the wrong container, because local fish came up from the beach in wicker baskets, wet and still cold, carried by the boys for a penny a load. What came off that cart was 42 wooden boxes packed with straw, and the straw was warm. Agnes opened 3 of them where they stood. The eyes had gone flat and sunken, the gills a dull brown at the edges, and the bellies gave under her thumb and did not come back. In the bottom layer of every box, the fish had been pressed until they burst, which meant they had been stacked and left standing a good while somewhere. Each box was chalked on the end with a letter and a number. B9. "These want holding apart," Agnes said. "Bay 2 on their own, and I'll look at them again in the morning by daylight." Gideon Rusk was 47 and wore a good coat even in a curing yard. He had promised a Newcastle house 120 barrels by the following Wednesday, and the boats had sat on the beach 9 days with a gale running. He told her the fish were that morning's fish and to put them through with the rest. Agnes asked him to write her objection in the yard book. "The book is for fish," he said, "not for opinions." So she wrote it in her own, standing at the salt bin with the pencil against her knee. Saturday, 10th. Boxes off the cart, 10:30. B9. Eyes flat, bellies soft, bottom layers pressed. Asked to hold apart. Refused. Salt out at midnight. 11 women worked that batch until 2 in the morning. Bess Tate, 42, split beside her for 6 of those hours and said twice that her wrist was going. And Agnes told her to slow her hands and keep her count, which is what a forewoman says when she cannot send anybody home. 18 days later, the barrels came back. Rusk paid off the whole crew that same morning. 11 women, 4 weeks of wages unpaid, and the sum owed to Agnes was £2 11 shillings and 4 pence, which she had already spent in her head on winter coal and boots for Bess's younger girl. He said the loss had to sit somewhere, and it sat on whoever had handled the salt. Agnes had been widowed 5 years. Daniel Bell died of a chest illness in the January after a bad autumn, and his 8th share in a cobble went to the doctor in the burial, and from there to a Sanderson from Amble, who sold the boat on again inside the year. She had 1 room above a net loft at 1 shilling and 9 pence a week, rented from a widow named Peggy Dodd, 51, who brought her bread on Sundays whether she wanted it or not. What kept her awake was none of that. It was Martha Crowe, 29, who had worked under her for 3 seasons and who stopped her at the top of the beach steps 2 days after the dismissal and asked, not unkindly, whether the salt really had been wrong. Gideon Rusk sent for her 13 days after that, on a Tuesday, and she went because £2 11 shillings and 4 pence is not a sum a person walks away from. He had the wage book open on the desk and a second paper beside it, and he turned the paper round so she could read it, which was a courtesy he had never shown her over a barrel of fish. It was a lease. Blackscar Smokehouse and Curing Yard, 7 years still to run out of 21, ground rent of £4 10 shillings a year, payable half at Whitsoon and half at Martinmas, with cart access along the lane to the Turnpike Road. You can have that against what's owed, he said. Or you can have the wages when the Newcastle business is settled, which may be a while and may be less. Agnes knew the building, and so did everyone on that coast. It had stood empty 6 years. The last 2 men to hold the lease had both given it up, and after the 18 barrels came back, Rusk had made a point of telling the buyer's carrier that the old Black Scar place had been mixed up in the business somewhere, which was not true and did not need to be true to do its work. She asked for a day. What she did in that day was walk. She went along the shore to Bulmer and asked at both yards for work for 11 women, and was told the season was thin, and at one of them, a man she had known for years, told her plainly that he was not taking on a crew that had spoiled a Newcastle order. She got as far as the coal office at the top of the lane before she understood that what Rusk had said about her salt would travel further and faster than she could walk. She came back on the Wednesday and signed. She had it witnessed in the shop by John Purvis, who was 55 and acted as witness for anything in that parish that needed one, and who charged her nothing but made her wait while he finished weighing out sugar. Agnes was a widow, which meant the lease was hers, in her own name, without a husband's signature standing over it. Purvis wrote the date, the 11th of September, 1867, and blotted it with a corner of newspaper. Rusk shook her hand at the yard gate and told her, in front of Ned Pearson, the haulier, 40, who carried fish for whoever paid, that he hoped she would find the place useful and should send word if she wanted advice on the smoking of it. Pearson laughed. Agnes put the folded lease in the pocket that did not have the notebook in it and walked up the lane. Bess Tate came with her the next morning and brought Eliza, 17, who had done 2 seasons of washing and packing and had never been trusted with a knife. Black Scar Cove is a rocky bight in the coast with a shingle landing, 9 fishermen's cottages, 3 net sheds, and a lane so steep that carts come down it with the wheel chained. The smokehouse sits at the bottom on the north side, a long, low building of dark red and gray sandstone with a taller chamber at the east end and a blackened vent standing up off the slates. The door had swollen so badly that Bess had to put her shoulder into it twice. Inside it was dark and cold and smelled of old soot and older fish. There was a wet patch under the roof leak the size of a cartwheel, and a bird had died in the salting room some time ago and been there ever since. Everything a person could see wanted mending, and the salt store floor was so damp that Agnes could press a thumbprint into it. Bess stood in the middle of the receiving shed with her arms folded and said the word most people say in a building like that. But Agnes had stopped listening because she was looking at the wall above the receiving door, where somebody long ago had lime-washed over the old paint, and where the lime wash had flaked away in 3 places in a line, and under each flaked place was a number. 1, 2, 3. 3 doors into that shed, 3 separate bays inside it, and when she went through into the chamber with a candle and held it up, 3 hanging rows, each with its own rail and its own run of hooks, walled off from the next by a course of brick. Rusk's yard at Craster Row had 1 great salting room and a chamber wide enough to hang 4,000 fish at once, with nothing between them but air, and in 9 years there Agnes had never once been able to say, of a finished barrel, which boat the fish in it came out of. Here she could. That was the whole of what she saw in the first hour, and it was worth more to her than the roof. So, here is the question worth holding on to. The same salt, out of the same bin, cured every barrel that yard sent out that month, and only the 18 with 1 chalk mark on them came back. What was different about those 18? Keep it in mind, because she was about to spend nearly every penny she had chasing the wrong answer. She spent 3 days going through the building the way she would go through a catch, walking the path the fish would take, from the seaward door to the trestles, to the cutting tables, to the 7 brining tubs, to the draining boards, through the low doorway into the chamber, and up onto the hooks, out to the cooling racks, in the cold end of the shed, and onto the barrel stands in the yard. The faults came out of it plainly enough. 1 slip course of slate on the north pitch, about a yard square, with 2 rotten battens under it. Drains blocked the whole way to the yard, grading, and the drain on the receiving floor running uphill for its first 2 feet because the ground had settled. 19 hooks gone and 41 usable, and both hanging rails sagging enough to bring the middle of a string too near the fire. The salt store floor drew damp straight up out of the ground because whoever laid it had put flags on bare earth without so much as a bed of ash. That last one was where she went wrong, and she went wrong for a good reason, which is the way it usually happens. Damp salt does not strike into a fish evenly. Agnes had seen it once in a yard at Amble where the sack stood against a wet wall all winter, and the fish out of that batch went soft in the shoulder. Rusk's salt store was built the same way as this one, on the same kind of ground, and the chamber at Craster Row leaked smoke through a cracked vent into the cutting room instead of sending it up through the fish. She wrote it in the blue book that night, at Peggy Dodd's table, by a candle. Bad salt store. Poor draw. That is what did it. Prove it here. She was wrong. She had the right kind of reasoning and the wrong subject, and it took her 5 more weeks and 1 ruined trial to find that out. On the Friday, Jamie Kerr came up the lane and stood in the yard with his cap in his hand. He was 28, held a 3rd share in a cobble called the Ellen Gray with his uncle and a man named Sam Dryden, and had known Agnes since he was a boy carrying baskets for a penny. He looked at the roof and at the drain grating and asked what she meant to do, and she told him plainly that she meant to cure fish in it, and he did not laugh, which she noted. He also would not promise her anything. "Rusk takes near enough all of it," he said. "If I sell round him and it goes wrong, I've a boat share and no buyer." Agnes said she would not ask him for a promise, only that he tell her when he had a small catch Rusk did not want, and bring it up the lane, and she would look at it in front of him and pay cash for whatever she took. The money went out over the next 9 days, and it went out fast. 120 second-hand slates from a yard at Almouth at 11 shillings the hundred and the carding on top, 6 lengths of batten, 4 pounds of nails, and 2 dozen iron hooks from Wilf Charlton, the smith at Long Houghton, who was 36, and made them in 1 evening for 3 shillings and 6 pence. 8 bushels of clean salt from Robert Ainsley's store at 2 shillings and 3 pence the bushel, cash, because Ainsley would not open an account for her. That left 1 pound and 4 pence in the tin, in a building with a hole in the roof. They started on the drains, because drains are the job nobody wants, and everything else stands still behind them. Bess brought a mattock and a length of chain, and Eliza carried the spoil out in a basket. The main run to the yard grating was 19 feet of stone channel under flags, and what came out of it over 2 days was weed, gravel, 40 years of fish waste, turned to a black grease that had set like tallow, and, halfway along, a wooden scoop with a broken handle that somebody had dropped in and never gone back for. Agnes kept the scoop. She had it on a nail in the salting room for the rest of that autumn and used it for nothing at all. Where the ground had settled and the channel ran uphill, they took up 4 flags, packed the bed with broken slate and beach shingle to bring the fall the right way, and set them back, and it was Bess who worked out they could do it by turning 2 of the flags over. The roof came next. Agnes went up on a ladder borrowed from a cottage at the top of the lane, stripped back the slipped course, cut out both rotten battens, and nailed in new. She dropped 1 slate off the ladder and broke it, and said nothing at all for about a minute, which Bess said afterwards was the loudest she had ever heard her. In the salt store they laid 2 courses of old brick and set boards across them on edge, so the sacks sat 6 inches clear of the flags with air running underneath. They scraped the loose soot off the chamber walls with a hoe and a wire brush, and did not scrape it back to clean stone, because you cannot and should not. They took the sag out of the rails with new bearers cut from a broken cutting table, put Charlton's hooks up in row 1, and shifted the sound old hooks to make row 2 whole. Eliza washed all 41 hooks in hot water and ash, and washed every tub, and then Agnes gave her a piece of chalk and told her to write the bay numbers back on the wall. Eliza wrote them in a careful, upright, schoolroom hand, 3 inches tall, and then stood back and looked at them for longer than the job needed. The first fire went in on the 29th of September, and it was a failure of a kind that did not matter. The oak shavings came from Cyrus Fenwick, the cooper at Howick, who was 63, and gave them a sack because he had known Daniel Bell, and they were damp through the middle. The smoke came heavy and low and went sideways out of the chamber door into the cutting room, and Bess stood in the yard coughing and calling Agnes names in a friendly way. They dried the next sack on the salting room floor for 3 days, wedged the chamber door true, packed the gap at the head of it with sacking, and Agnes went up on the roof again and cleared a gull's nest out of the vent, some of which was fishing line. The second fire went in on the 2nd of October, in the evening, so they could see it against the dark. It came up off the hearth slow and pale and went where it was supposed to go, up through all 3 rows and out at the vent in a thin, steady stream that leaned inland with the wind. Nothing came out of the door, and Agnes stood in the yard a long time with her arms folded. Eliza asked whether they were finished now, and Bess told her that in a fish yard you are never finished, you are only between things. Jamie Kerr brought the first catch on the 4th of October, off the Ellen Gray, and was honest about it, because it was not a great catch. 11 baskets, and Agnes went through every one on the trestles in front of him with Bess at her elbow. The fish were sound, but they were all sizes, from big, deep autumn herring down to a great many small thin ones, because the shoal had been mixed and the net had taken what was in it. Agnes weighed the lot at 430 pounds, paid him 9 shillings and sixpence out of the tin, and wrote his boat mark in the blue book. Bess picked a big herring out of one basket and a small one out of another and held them up, one in each hand. "These two are not the same fish," she said. "You'll not hang them the same time." Agnes said she knew that, and that the season was going and the salt was bought, and there were 11 baskets to get through before the fish went off, with 1 fire and 3 rows and 4 pairs of hands, and that they would take the whole of it through together and grate it after, in the barrel. Bess put both herring down on the table and went to get her knife. They worked the catch through on the 5th of October, starting at 6 in the morning. Bess split, with Martha Crowe beside her, who had come up the lane on her own and asked for work and had not mentioned the conversation on the beach steps, and Eliza carried and washed while Agnes salted. They put the fish into brine in 5 tubs by the clock and not by the fish, drained them on the boards for the same length of time, whether they were 9 inches or 5, hung them across all 3 rows in the order they came to hand, and lit the hearths at 4 in the afternoon. Agnes sat up with the fire until 2 in the morning, and Bess took it from 2 until 6. It looked well when they drew it, which was the trouble. Coming down off the hooks in a dim chamber with a lantern, a string of herring looks like a string of herring, and it was only when Eliza laid them out on the cooling racks in daylight that the 2 ends of the catch showed themselves. The small fish had gone too far, dark and hard across the back and dry in the flesh, and they had lost so much weight that Agnes could feel it in a handful. The big fish had not gone far enough, pale in the shoulder and soft under the thumb at the thick part behind the head, which is exactly where a fish will let you down 4 days later in a grocer's back room in Durham. Between the two, there were perhaps 400 fish that were right. Agnes packed 42 of the best strings into 2 barrels for a sample and stood in the yard and did not want to write the letter. In 21 years, she had never had cause to speak to a buyer. Buyers were the men who came into Rusk's yard in good coats, asked a question about her fish, and were answered by Rusk. She said out loud that a Newcastle merchant would read 3 lines in her hand and put the paper in the fire, and Eliza, who had been to school until she was 12, said she would write it if Agnes told her what to say. The letter went on the 8th of October. Samuel Reed came on the 11th. He was 45, in a black coat, and he came in a hired trap with a clerk who stayed outside with the pony and was never introduced. He did not admire the building. He asked where the fish came from, what day it landed, what day it was salted, and what day it was drawn, all before he opened anything. Then he went along the cooling racks, picking fish out with 2 fingers, one here, one from the far end, one from the middle of a string, smelling each at the gill and pressing the shoulder and laying them in a line on the bench as he went. 12 fish, and it took him about 4 minutes. 2 strings out of row 2 are as good as I buy anywhere, he said. Agnes waited. And I can't take an order off you, he said. He explained it the way a man explains a thing he has explained many times. He sold to grocers, and a grocer bought a barrel on the strength of the last one. So when the lid came off, every fish in it had to be the same color and firmness and weight in the hand. He could sell hard fish and he could sell soft fish, he said, but not a barrel with both, and nothing done further down the line would put right what was mixed at the start. He said he would come again if she sent word, in the tone of a man who says that to a great many people, and then he got back in the trap and the clerk turned the pony in the lane and they went up the hill. Agnes stood in the yard for a while, then went into the salting room, where Bess was tipping out a tub, and told her sharply that it had been left standing half full since the morning and that they could not afford to be careless with brine at 2 shillings and 3 pence the bushel. Bess set the tub down on its rim and looked at her. "It's not the tub," Bess said. "No," Agnes said. "It isn't." She sat down on the end of the cutting table and said that Bess had stood in that room with a big herring in one hand and a small one in the other, and told her, and that she had heard it and gone on anyway because she wanted the whole catch through in one day. Bess let her get all the way to the end of it before she said anything. "Right," Bess said. "So we do it twice," which was the correct answer, and the thing Agnes had been avoiding, because doing it twice meant fewer fish through the chamber in a day, and fewer fish meant less money, and there were 4 weeks of the season left at the outside. It started with a piece of paper that Gideon Rusk had left lying about himself. When the barrels came back, he had not only talked, he had a clean copy made of his receiving entries for that week and left it at the shop, so that anybody in the parish who wanted to know how the loss had happened could read it, and it had done its work for 3 weeks. Purvis took it out of the drawer under the counter, and when Agnes asked whether she could copy it, He pushed the inkstand across and went back to his sugar. She read it that night beside her own book, both of them open on Peggy Dodd's table. Rusk's entries ran like this. Friday, the 9th of August, afternoon, 4 baskets off the rocks, hand lines, 110 pounds, then a gap. Then Saturday, the 10th of August, morning, 42 boxes, fresh landing, local boats, 3,900 weight. Then Saturday, the 10th, salted, day work. Her own book, for the 10th, said this. Boxes off the cart, 10:30. B, 9. Eyes flat, belly soft, bottom layers pressed. Asked to hold apart, refused. Salt out at midnight. Salt out at midnight. There was no midnight in his book at all. Saturday went into Sunday and his page went from day work straight on to the Monday, and 11 women had stood at those tables until 2:20 in the morning with not one of them on the paper. Agnes got Bess out of her kitchen at 9 at night to be sure she was not remembering it the way she wanted to. Bess said 2:20 and knew it because she had gone home past the Ainsley cart outside the public house and thought at the time that even the Carters were in bed. Then there was the other line, and the other line was worse. Fresh landing, local boats. Agnes went down to the shingle in the morning and asked Jamie Kerr when the boats had last been off before the 11th of August. And Jamie did not have to think about it, and neither did his uncle, and neither did old Sam Dryden, who was 59, and said only that it had been a filthy fortnight and went on mending his net. Nothing went off that beach between the 2nd of August and the 11th, and nothing went off Bulmer either. 42 boxes of fresh local herring had been landed on a Saturday when there was not a boat in the water for 11 miles in either direction. She walked the 4 miles to the station at Almouth on the Thursday. Thomas Niven was 54 and had kept the goods book at that station for 19 years, and he did not like being asked things sideways. So Agnes asked him straight whether the book would show a consignment from August, who it came to, and when it was fetched away. The book shows what the book shows, Niven said, and turned it back. He found it in about a minute and a half and read it out flat, the way a man reads a list. 9th of August. From Berwick. 42 boxes fish, consigned to G. Rusk, Craster Row. In at 6 minutes past 6 in the evening, out by cart, 10th of August, 20 minutes to 9 in the morning. Agnes asked him where the boxes had been in between. In the goods shed, Niven said. Where else would they be? He shut the book and told her he had told her what was written, that he would tell Gideon Rusk the same if Gideon Rusk asked him, and that he had a down train at 4 and would thank her to stand clear of the barrow. She walked the 4 miles back, and she did not hurry. The fish had been caught off Berwick and had already traveled before they were put on a train. They came down the line on a Friday evening in August, when a goods shed with the doors shut is as warm as a kitchen, stood there all night, and by the time they came off the tail of that cart at 10:30 the next morning, they were finished. Nothing in her hands and no bin of salt in Northumberland could have brought them back, which meant the wet salt store was not the answer, and the leaking vent at Craster Row was not the answer, and she had spent £1 11 shillings and 3 weeks of her life on a roof that wanted doing anyway. She sat down on the wall above the cove and worked out what the paper was worth, which was nothing on its own. She could take it to the parish, and Rusk would say a woman with a grudge had copied his book wrong, and the Newcastle house would go on buying from the man they had always bought from. Nobody hands a woman a trade because she can prove a night is missing. She had to have fish out of that chamber, in a barrel with her mark on it, in front of a buyer who did not care in the least about her or about Gideon Rusk. Then the paper would be worth something. Cyrus Fenwick cut the tallies for her on the 16th of October and would not take money for them. They were nothing much, only split oak laths 9 inches long, a number burned into each, sawn through the middle so that each made a pair. The grain runs where it runs, and 2 halves either match or they do not. 1 half went into the receiving entry with the boat mark and the weight, and the other went with the fish, into the bay, along the row, and into the barrel. Jamie brought the catch on the 18th, off the Ellen Gray, and this time Agnes graded it on the shingle before it came up the lane. She went through it basket by basket in front of him, put back 2 that had been under the anchor and were bruised down one side, and said why, in the open, where his uncle could hear it. Then she weighed what she took, 620 pounds, and paid him 14 shillings on the beach. Jamie stood there with the money and said that Rusk paid at the end of the month and sometimes at the end of the next one. Upstairs in the yard, the whole thing came apart into 3. Big fish to bay 1 and row 1, middling to bay 2 and row 2, small to bay 3 and row 3, with 3 tally pairs, 3 weights, and 3 entries in Eliza's hand, written the way she wrote everything, upright and slow, with the date at the head of the page. They brined the big fish longer than the middling and the middling longer than the small. They drained them by looking at them instead of by the clock until the skin went dull and dry to the back of the hand. They hung the small fish in row 3, which was furthest from the hearse, and Agnes drew that row a full 3 hours before the others, and did not go to bed until it was down. Bess kept the crew off the knives a quarter of an hour every 2 hours, and would not be argued with, and Martha Crowe, who had been at it since 6, said that in 9 years at Craster Row nobody had ever told her to sit down. They drew row 1 on the morning of the 20th. Agnes went along it fish by fish with her thumb and found what she was looking for, which was very little difference between the first fish and the last. 6 barrels. Fenwick coopered them at 3 shillings and 3 pence apiece for barrel and hoops. Eliza chalked the boat mark, the date, the row, and the tally number on every head, and Agnes checked all 6 against the paired halves in the receiving book before the lids went on. Samuel Reed came on the 23rd of October in the same hired trap. He did what he had done before, and it took him longer, because this time he opened 4 of the 6 and brought fish up from the bottom with his arm and weighed 2 barrels himself. He asked Eliza about the tally number on the 3rd barrel, and Eliza took the receiving book off the shelf, found the entry, and put the matching half of the oak lath in his hand. Reed turned the lath over twice. "Where did this one come from?" he said, and Eliza told him the boat, the day, the weight landed, and the row. He bought all 6 at 16 shillings the barrel, £4 16 shillings, and it was the first money that building had made in 6 years. Then he stood in the yard with his gloves in his hand and said he would take 24 barrels of the same, all of them like the 6, at the goods station at Alnmouth on the morning of the 9th of November for the noon train, and not a day after it, because he had grocers in Durham and Darlington waiting on the strength of what he had just tasted. He put down £5 against it and had Agnes sign for the money. He also said, without any change in his voice at all, that if the 24 were not like the 6, he would not be back a 3rd time. 24 barrels in 17 days meant 4 times the fish, and 4 times the fish meant 2 more boats, more salt, more hands, and a great deal that went wrong. Robert Turnbull of the Providence, 44, came up the lane on the 25th of October and said he had heard she weighed on the beach and paid on the beach, and Andrew Hall of the 2 sisters, 33, came 2 days later and said it in fewer words. Agnes wrote out 3 agreements, 1 for each boat, and had Purvis witness them. She would look at the catch before she took it, say no in front of them and not afterwards, weigh on her own beam with the boatsman standing at it, and pay the same day. Turnbull still owed Rusk £11 on a net. He signed anyway, and asked her not to say so. The tub in the corner of the salting room opened a seam on the 28th and put 40 gallons across the floor and into the new drain, which at least proved the drain, and Fenwick set 2 new staves and a hoop the next morning for 1 and 6 pence. The first 16 barrels came back from Fenwick's man with the hoops a half-inch short at the chime, because he had cut them off a bad pattern, and every one of them had to go back up the coast and come down again, which lost a day. The fuel was worse. It rained 4 days at the end of October. The oak shavings went damp in the sack, and damp shavings make a wet, dirty smoke that leaves a taste on the fish and no good color. Agnes lost most of a night's hanging in row 2 before she would admit what it was. After that, they kept the week's shavings inside, on boards along the salting room wall where the heat came through from the chamber, and Eliza turned them every morning like a woman turning oatmeal. On the 1st of November, a boat out of Bulmer that was not one of the 3 came in with a good catch, and Agnes turned the whole of it away on the shingle in front of 9 people because it had stood too long and the bellies were going. The skipper told her what he thought of her. Turnbull, standing there, said nothing at all and went home and told 2 other men about it. Eliza took the receiving book over entirely from the end of October, with the boat, the day, the hour landed, the weight, the condition, the bay, and the tally number. Agnes still looked at every fish, but she had stopped being the only person who knew what had happened to it. They were 9 women by the 4th of November in 2 shifts that overlapped at midday, which was Bess's idea, because the chamber wanted watching at night and nobody can watch a fire and split fish in the same 24 hours. Packers had 10 pence a day and splitters 1 shilling and 2 pence. Agnes paid out of Reed's £5 on the 2nd of November, in coin, on the cutting table, and wrote every name and sum in the book, and Martha Crowe counted hers twice. Gideon Rusk drove down the lane on the 5th of November and stopped his trap at the gate. He did not get out. He sat there and looked at the vent, where the smoke was going up in a thin, steady line and leaning inland, and at the carts in the yard, and at the barrel stands, which had been mended, and at Eliza standing at the trestles with the book open. Then he backed the trap around in the lane and went up the hill. Rusk moved on the 6th, and he moved in 3 places at once, which is what a man does when he has been in a trade 30 years. Robert Ainsley sent word that he could not let her have the next 12 bushels except for cash laid down before it left the store, and mentioned in the same 3 lines that there was some question about the standing of the Black Scar lease. Rusk went along the coast and offered Turnbull and Hall a penny a stone over what Agnes was paying for the season, on his word. And he wrote to Samuel Reed, on his own headed paper, to say he felt bound to tell a man he had dealt with for 9 years that the Black Scar yard was the very place mixed up in the spoiled consignment in August. Agnes found the cash for the salt by selling Daniel's sea chest and the clock to Purvis for £1 6 shillings. Turnbull came and told her about the penny a stone himself. He had asked Rusk to put it in writing, and Rusk had laughed at him. And a man who laughs at you over a penny will laugh at you over £11, he said, and then he went off to shoot his nets. The gale came in on the night of the 7th, 2 days before the train. It blew out of the northeast for 30 hours and put every boat on that coast up the beach on rollers with the gear stowed. Agnes had 17 barrels finished and covered in the cold end of the shed. She needed 7 more, and there was nothing in the water. Ned Pearson came down the lane on the 8th at 8 in the morning with an offer, pleasant about it, making it clear he was only carrying a message. There were 19 boxes of herring standing at the goods station. They had come down the line, they were going cheap because nobody wanted them at that price with the weather as it was, and a woman who was 7 barrels short of a Newcastle order 2 days before the train might find them useful. Nobody would ever know what was in the bottom of a barrel. Agnes asked him what day they had come in. Pearson said the 6th, then thought about it and said possibly the 5th. She told him no, and she told him at the gate, and she did not explain herself. And Pearson shrugged and turned the cart and went back up the lane. Bess found her in the salting room afterwards with the receiving book open at the tally page. 17 honest barrels, Bess said. He'll take 17 or he'll not. Agnes said that Reed had told her 24 and had put down £5 against 24 and had said what would happen if it was not 24. Then Jamie Kerr came in off the beach at 4 in the afternoon, wet to the shoulder, and said the sea was going down and they would try it before light if it held. 3 boats went off Black Scar shingle at 4:30 on the morning of the 9th, in the dark, which is not a thing anybody does for a merchant. The Ellen Gray, the Providence, and the 2 sisters came in at 7:30 with 3 small catches that were nothing separately, and together, on Agnes's beam, 2,090 pounds of fish, so fresh the scales were still tight on them. There was no time to be clever with it. They graded on the shingle by lantern, took the middling and the large, put the small back into the boats, and ran the whole of it through in 1 day and 1 night, with 9 women and every tub in the building. At 6 on the morning of the 11th, they had 7 more barrels, 24 in all, and Agnes had missed the 9th of November by 2 days. She sent Eliza up to Alnmouth with a note, and the note said that the 24 barrels were made and were what she had promised and were 2 days late, and that Mr. Reed could come and look at them at Black Scar, or he could keep his £5 and hear no more about it. Reed came on the 13th of November at 9 in the morning, and he brought Thomas Niven down with him in the trap because the barrels were going in a truck of their own, and Niven had the labels and the consignment note to make out at the yard. There were a good many people in that yard by 9:30. The 9 women, Jamie Kerr and his uncle, Turnbull, Hall and 2 of his crew, and Peggy Dodd, who had no business there whatever and had brought bread. Reed took his coat off and worked for 40 minutes. He had the barrels rolled out and picked 6 of the 24 himself, and not from the front. He knocked the lids off, went down into each to the elbow, brought fish up from the bottom, smelled them at the gill, pressed the shoulder, and weighed 2 barrels on the beam. Then he asked Eliza for the book, took the paired halves of the tallies out of the receiving entries, and matched them against the halves that came up out of the barrels, one at a time, on the cutting table, in front of everybody. 6 pairs, 6 boats, and days and weights, all of it in a 17-year-old girl's handwriting. Gideon Russ came down the lane while Reed was doing it, with an old barrel in the back of the trap and his yard ledger under his arm. He stood the barrel on end and knocked the lid off, and the smell went across that yard the way it had gone across his own in August. And he said this was the work of the woman Mr. Reed was buying from, and that he had the entries to prove it, and he opened the ledger at the week and held it up. Agnes did not raise her voice and she did not talk about herself. She asked Reed to finish the sixth barrel first, and he finished it and said all six were sound and alike, and that he had no fault to find in any of them. Then she asked Gideon to read out the entry he was holding. He read it out. Saturday, the 10th of August, morning 42 boxes, fresh landing, local boats. Agnes put her own book on the table, open at the 10th of August, with the line at the bottom of it, salt out at midnight. She said there was no midnight in his book and there never had been, and that 11 women had worked at his tables until 20 past 2 on the Sunday morning, and not one of them was on his paper. Bess named the hour, and Martha Crowe named it after her. Jamie Kerr said no boat had gone off any beach between Craster and Bulmer, between the 2nd of August and the 11th, and his uncle said it, and Turnbull said it, and nobody in that yard contradicted them, because everybody in that yard had been on the beach that fortnight. Then Agnes turned to Thomas Niven and asked him only what the goods book said. Niven did not look at Rusk and did not look at Agnes. He said that on the 9th of August, 42 boxes of fish had come down from Berwick consigned to G. Rusk of Craster Row, in at 6 minutes past 6 in the evening, out by cart at 20 minutes to 9 the next morning, and in the goods shed in between, and that he would say the same in any place he was asked. Samuel Reed looked at the ledger in Rusk's hands for a moment. He was not interested in the quarrel, and he did not pretend to be. Those fish were 2 days old before anybody salted them, he said. You cannot smoke that out of a herring, and I would not buy from a yard that thought you could. He took the 24 barrels at 17 shillings and wrote an order at the cutting table for 36 barrels a week for the rest of the season, on the one condition that the tallies in the receiving book went on exactly as they were, because he meant to send the second half of every tally back with any barrel he had a complaint about. Ned Pearson loaded them, because Ned Pearson carried for whoever paid. Gideon Rusk stood at the gate with his ledger under his arm and watched 2 carts go up the lane with her mark chalked on every head, and then he got into his trap and followed them, because it was the only road out. She paid the women on the 14th, in coin, on the cutting table, the way she had paid them the first time. 9 names: Bess Tate, Martha Crowe, Eliza Tate, Hannah Croft, Mary Stobbs, and 4 more, with the sum against each and the day's work beside it. She set 11 pounds aside in the tin for slate and battens and the north pitch, which wanted doing properly before February, and another 4 for salt bought outright so that Robert Ainsley could think what he liked about the lease. The Ellen Gray, the Providence, and the 2 sisters took a weekly arrangement, by name, in writing, witnessed at the shop. She nailed a board by the seaward door with the buying weights and prices chalked on it, where a man could read them before he handed over a basket. Gideon Rusk went on trading. He had his yard, his salt credit, and his Newcastle house, and lost none of them. What he no longer had was the road between a boat on that shingle and a grocer in Darlington, because it did not run through him anymore. Agnes Bell was 35 years old, 5 years a widow, and had been paid off with a ruin. 2 pounds 11 shillings and 4 pence, taken in stone and soot instead of coin, had bought her a roof, a chamber that drew, and her own name on a consignment note. On the 15th, she brought down a new yard ledger from Purvis's shop, 3 shillings and 9 pence, the pages ruled and blank. She opened it flat on the cutting table and put the blue book beside it, salt stiff at the corners, with 11 of its pages taken up by the 10th of August. Then she held the pen out to Eliza. Eliza asked what she should put. Write what you saw, Agnes said. So Eliza wrote it. The Ellen Gray, the 15th of November, 1867, 490 pounds, Bay 1. The smoke went up off the vent in a thin, steady line and leaned inland, and down on the shingle Jamie Kerr's uncle was already coming up the lane with the first basket on his shoulder.